Welcome to the Fright Lab. I'm Lucas Yoakum. And with me today is the only producer who might talk me out of watching a movie like this, Joseph Wren. Joe, why do I do this to myself?
Only Pazuzu knows for sure. In the case of this film, only a man wearing a wasp costume could possibly deliver fruit in a timely fashion, which is a nice way of saying, how are you this evening, all of you gruesome people? I am confused as well. I don't know what this film is. I don't even know why this film is The Exorcist II, but I imagine it has something to do with a person at the production house deciding that we have to put Linda Blair in the movie and it has to be Exorcist II. Even though The Exorcist was pretty definitive in my opinion, this one's going to get really weird for many reasons, not just involving insect costumes.
I don't know how one follows that up. So let's, you know what I say? Let's just plow into the script and we'll see what happens. I'm sure that our listeners have seen a movie at some point that's been described as, quote unquote, the worst movie of all time.
It's not Troll 2. Not by definition.
I will finish the sentence if it fucking kills me, Joe. And a good many of my friends and associates, and even a couple members of our audience, assume, for some reason, that I really enjoy bad movies. And that's not true. I like weird movies. There's a big difference there. And that isn't to say that I don't have a soft spot for the bad stuff. Movies like The Incredible Melting Man and The Human Centipede might be fodder for heckling, but I do love those pieces of dreck.
The Incredible Melting Man, that's where he turns blue and literally falls apart on screen?
It's more red. It's more of a red kind of chunky salsa color.
Fair enough, sir.
Right. Most of our listeners have probably seen an Ed Wood movie or maybe even watched Tommy Wiseau's The Room with some glee. But what do you do with a movie that is so ambitiously bizarre, so hopelessly convoluted, that it feels like it takes years off of your life despite a 2-hour runtime? What about a sequel to a film that is widely regarded as one of the scariest ever made, or a movie regarded as the shining example of horror as quote-unquote real cinema? We are, of course, talking about Exorcist II, The Heretic, directed by John Boorman. I had only seen this movie once, probably in the late 1990s or the early 2000s. I think it might have been like a Halloween party or something, or I don't know, I don't remember. So my memory of it is hazy at best. I was aware of the reputation of Exorcist II. It's been called the worst sequel ever made and considered in some places to be the worst movie ever made. And I thought to myself, how bad can it be? Friends, siblings, my dear audience, I was a fool. Exorcist II, The Heretic, is the definition of a bad watch. As I said a few minutes back, it is a film that is so weird it feels like it breaks ground on new ways to be weird. It's only a 2-hour movie, shorter than a good many movies I actually enjoy, but it feels like it is stripping time out of your life with a chisel. It's simultaneously a bonkers movie with an insane, hopelessly unhinged plot, and yet it's a slog, an absolute drag of a movie to watch. How can so much insanity be happening on film and yet somehow find new ways to bore you to tears? How can a movie be this bad? And I'm really stuck on this point. Am I being melodramatic? Am I riding a now 45-plus-year-old hype train? As someone who really likes weird movies, what is it about this movie that is so awful? Tonight, we're going to try to exorcise a demon of my own. See what I did there?
Well done.
Specifically, I want to talk about where Exorcist II went wrong. Despite having all the requisite parts needed to make a serviceable sequel, how did they blow it so hard? I've had some time to really pick apart this idea, and I want to share my theory right here.
4 years ago, The Exorcist shocked the world. Now, the struggle between good and evil goes on. Exorcist II, The Heretic.
Sorry, that song kills me. That's enough. Holy God.
Does nothing happen in this trailer?
Rather like the rest of the film. Not much, no.
All right, let's get back into it. How about some dark ambient shit?
Please do. We've already talked about the subject of possessions on this show back in episode number 29. We don't want to spend too much time on this subject, but we do briefly have to talk about The Exorcist, if only like tangentially. It serves as context, if nothing else. Friedkin's film, The Exorcist, is the stuff of cinematic legend, of course. I don't need to tell you how popular it is or how well regarded it is in the horror community, you know? Personally, I think it holds up. But I also think that The Exorcist is incredibly difficult to talk about at this point. When we are talking about this movie, we run the risk of not actually talking about the movie at all. The risk implicit there is talking about the legend that surrounds the film. And astute listeners might be thinking right about now, Lucas, which legend? And that would be a valid question. Are we talking about the difficult production of the film? Or are we discussing that Blatty's novel is very loosely based on an event that occurred in St. Louis in the 1950s? Allegedly, a young man was possessed by a demonic entity and successfully had the entity removed from him by a Catholic priest, not in St. Louis, but that's not relevant to the story, right? So what are we talking about here? What did The Exorcist do to people that made it so damnably legendary? In the show notes to this episode, I have included a New York Times article from January of 1974. This article is talking to Catholic priests and gives us a little context about how badly The Exorcist really shook people up. There is also a persistent myth that The Exorcist led to an inflation of numbers in church attendance. Alas, I haven't been able to find any real hard textual evidence of that. Now, if you happen to be a theologian with any input on this, or for that matter, a researcher surrounding religion, reach out to us at thefrightlabpodcast@gmail.com because we want to talk to you about this subject. It's one that I find very interesting. Irrespective of the legend in question, I think that the legendary status of The Exorcist is the first point that we have to deal with. It doesn't matter how good Exorcist II, The Heretic is or is not. I think that Friedkin's film was, and still is, an incredibly effective piece of horror. For the time period, I don't know of any widely seen horror movie, 60s and 70s that might compare. I know that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre came out in 74, a year after The Exorcist. It's also viewed as an effective and highly influential piece of horror. In fact, there hasn't been an episode in like 5 episodes that I haven't brought it up. Fans of this show, however, also know that Texas Chainsaw is the gold standard for pre-2000s horror cinema, in my opinion. So we don't need to belabor that point further. I suspect that a lot of very popular and influential horror movies came out in this era, each one being more effectively scary than the one before it. Something about the time period, something in the soil. It was just fertile, I guess. That whole era is a real smorgasbord of movies, right? If you weren't scared by demonic possession, maybe backwood Texas murderers or cannibals might do the trick, The Exorcist wasn't just scary, it was really scary. Maybe even uniquely scary for that time period. Why? I don't know. Better people have talked about it than me, so I'm not going to try to elaborate on that too terribly much. Exorcist II, The Heretic? Well, just isn't. Which, I guess, means we actually have to talk about the plot of Exorcist II now. God help me.
We've mentioned it before, and I've heard from many people in my own family who have been alive much longer than me. The reason The Exorcist was scary is because of your upbringing. It's because you believe that can actually happen. I'm not here to debate your beliefs or mine, but I think that is the easiest standout of that film. If this was real, and a lot of people believed it could be, then by definition, that is the scariest thing you've ever seen on film.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. Taking a movie that I've mentioned in other episodes, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on here, but a movie like High Tension, which is, it's a little fantasy, but it feels very realistic while you're watching it up till the plot turns on the dime that it does. Part of it feels real because I think a lot of people are very afraid of the stranger kicking down their door and coming and murdering them. Statistically, not a thing that's very likely to happen, but it feels real. It could, on some level, maybe happen. Now, we here on the show, as a rule, don't really sit and talk religion. I think it's kind of outside of our mandate. Let's say it's kind of maybe a thing that I just don't want to deal with. It's not really realistic. I have my beliefs. You have your beliefs. Everybody's got their own thing, and that's perfectly fine. No arguments here. Whatever. Not going to get into it. But yeah, I guess if you feel like this could really happen, quote unquote, it feels more real, which is weird though, right? Because think about a movie like The Terminator. I know that seems like a weird jump, but hear me out here. The Terminator is a very effective action film, sure, but it's also scary as shit, right? This idea of an utterly implacable monster that you can't stop, that absolutely will not stop until you are dead.
It's secretly a horror movie.
It is secretly, clandestinely, pardon the pun, under the skin, a horror film. But no one talks about The Terminator in the same vein that they talk about The Exorcist. Yeah, granted, yeah, they're different movies. But you see my point, right? There are plenty of other seminal horror movies that we just don't discuss. You know, earlier today, prior to us recording this episode, we were talking about how effective The Mummy, the classic Universal film, how effective I think that movie is. And yet, we don't talk about it in the same breath we talk about The Exorcist. I think you might be right. Maybe belief is the thing that really fuels that fire. Exorcist II, The Heretic, follows Regan, the original victim in the first film, as a young adult. While she seemingly no longer has a demon inside of her, she is still, shall we say, somewhat haunted by the experiences from earlier in her life. You know, seems pretty reasonable, I guess. She's in therapy, which is always good. But this is some wacky fucking therapy. We'll get to that in just a second. Throughout the film, we're also following Father Philip Lamont, a Catholic priest and exorcist. After, botched exorcism that we get to watch, he is called upon by the Vatican to investigate the death of Father Marin, an elderly priest who helped exorcise Regan in the first film. Max von Sydow, who portrayed Father Marin in the first film, does make a brief appearance in this movie. It's almost a cameo, but he makes a brief appearance in this movie. And God damn it, he deserved better than this. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Let me get back on track here.
They can't all be Memento, my friend.
I know. God, I don't even like that movie either. Anyway, naturally, this means that Father Lamont and Regan have to meet. And here's where the plot, already a little loosey-goosey to begin with, starts to come apart at the seams. So, spoilers ahead. Future Joe, would you kindly let our audience know where they can skip to, please?
The next section of the Fright Lab contains spoilers for Exorcist II, The Heretic. If you really want to go down this rabbit hole blind, skip forward to 16 minutes and 46 seconds.
Regan is in, therapy of a sort. This therapy involves some sort of spooky hypnosis machine that allows a therapist to, harmonize their brain with the patient and see what's going on in their head. How does this work? You might be asking. Fuck you, the movie says, and refuses to explain how it works. So, Father Lamont gets in on the action and sees Father Merrin being killed by a demonically possessed Reagan. Still with me? Okay, good. So, as a result, Father Lamont learns about Father Merrin's time in Africa. Doesn't really say where, but whatever. Where he exorcised a young man, apparently from the same demon. Now, it's right about here, this point, that the movie absolutely falls apart. If you've seen it, you know. And I know if you haven't seen it, you're thinking, how? All I have to say is go watch it. The movie falls apart because it has, well, something to do with locusts. So Father Lamont is off to Africa to investigate, and Reagan is left to fend for herself, and we're going to yada, yada, yada ahead of some details here, mostly because they don't make any goddamn sense, with or without context. So, in brief, Father Lamont learns about the Locusts, a demon named Pazuzu, and a young boy that Merrin exorcised. He's alive and working on locusts for some reason, and that's played by James Earl Jones. R.I.P., Mr. Jones. You deserved better than this. Again. So anyway, there's locusts, and another possession, and another exorcism. The end. And it's right about here that things become very frustrating for me. How did this movie, with this absolutely bonkers plot, happen? I don't think it's just the plot. We need to rewind. Let's start with the cast. Okay, you got Linda Blair, James Earl Jones, Richard Burton, Ned Beatty, and an appearance by Max von Sydow. That is, by any standard, an amazing cast. How could it be bad? Okay, let's double down. Let's talk music. Siblings, I have two words for you. Ennio Morricone. That man is a legend in the world of film scores, and rightly so. And let's take it up a notch. Let's go one step higher. This movie was directed by John Boorman. That name is ringing a bell. It's because he also directed Deliverance, Excalibur, and Beyond Rangoon. He is, at his best, a director with a clear artistic vision and style. And in a few spaces within this movie, it actually shows. There are some genuinely beautiful shots, some actually inspired moments in this movie, such as a scene where Reagan is on the roof of her apartment building in downtown New York in the 1980s in the rising sun. It is a genuinely gorgeous scene. It's just beautiful. It's beautifully shot. There's also scenes that are, well, interesting, if nothing else, such as anything involving James Earl Jones and Richard Burton in the same room together. They're cool, if not incredibly bizarre. But we need to talk honestly for a second. John Boorman is the man who directed Zardoz. You know, we've talked about it, I think. The movie with Sean Connery in a red loincloth and pistols worshiping a giant gun-vomiting stone head that venerates the gun over the penis. Joe, I've included in the notes a very specific link that I would like for you to follow. If you could, would you kindly, Maestro, do us the honors?
I was hoping you'd let me remind the audience of how glorious this film actually is.
I will never stop.
Zardoz speaks to you, his chosen ones.
The chosen one!
You have been raised up from brutality to kill the brutals who multiply, and are legion. To this end, Zardoz, your god, gave you the gift of the gun. The gun is good.
The gun is good!
The penis is evil. The penis shoots seeds and makes new life to poison the earth with a plague of men, as once it was. But the gun shoots death and purifies the earth of the filth of brutals. Go forth and kill.
Have you ever considered the possibility that Russell Crowe's rendition of Noah's Ark is the same film as Zardoz?
No. Why would I ever think about that? I'm beginning to question our creative partnership, Joe. Okay, and for the fans, I will include the link to that clip in our show notes so the audience can appreciate not only how utterly insane that sequence is, but also just like, I don't know, slap that in the background of your next house party. You know, you got the family over. It's Christmas time. I mean, it's November when we're recording this. Christmas is just around the corner. Guys, why not really fucking alienate the rest of your family by showing a clip of Zardoz in between performances of Mariah Carey's All I Want Is You?
You brutal motherfucker.
What can I say, Joe? The gun is good and the penis is evil. I really do think that a lot of the problems in this movie probably end with John Boorman. And listen, I'm a fan of John Boorman. I think he can be a genuinely inspired director. Excalibur, still one of my top 100 favorite movies. But the creative direction of this film, in most people's opinion, ultimately starts and ends with him, John Boorman, right here. We can also point some of the blame at William Peter Blatty, the original author of the novel The Exorcist, for contributing to this mess, along with co-writers William Goodhart and Roscoe Pollenberg. Yeah, that's right. People want to blame just Boorman on this one, but no. The blame, there's plenty to go around. Okay, so we have an ultra scary movie, The Exorcist, with an intense backstory being followed up by a movie that's not. The original has a really tightly written script, incredible visuals, and a fantastic cast. The sequel has a great cast, but, it's missing a good script and consistently good visuals. The sequel also suffers from an anguished script and an inconsistent director. It took a long time to get this done. All of that by itself should be sufficient to explain what went wrong with The Exorcist II. But I think there might be an explanation here. Follow me. The greatest enemies Exorcist II, the Heretic, have are twofold. To start, one, that there was an attempt to make a sequel to The Exorcist. And for all of the complaints we can have about the impact of The Exorcist on horror cinema, I think it's impossible to argue how effective the story is. The theatrical cut of the film runs just over 2 hours and never seems to stall out, right? Its pacing as a film, as well as its editing, make it feel faster than that. It never drags. And outside of some background actors who aren't, really on screen, so to speak, everyone in that story kind of makes sense. While I am critical of stories that are simply good versus evil, it is actually a compelling plot. Why do bad things happen to good people? It's kind of one of those classic plots, right? All of that is to say, it's a total package of a movie and has almost no loose ends. Barely rare when you get right down to it. And sure, the director's cut does run a little long, but rewards you with a lot of extra fun scares. Spider walk? Anyone? Does anyone remember the spider walk sequence? Spooky as shit. And even if the second film followed the same plot beats of the original and just kind of upped the metaphorical ante of scares, what would you have? Pale imitation, I suspect. I imagine that the so-called Turkish exorcist, Satan, would ultimately be achieving roughly the same thing.
Do tell. I'm not familiar with this film.
You haven't seen The Turkish Exorcist?
Absolutely not. Why would I bother with anything that's not just The Exorcist?
Every so often a thing happens in a creative person's life where they realize where their creative partner is on the same page with them and where their creative partner is on a different creative page than them. And the fact that you've never looked at something called The Turkish Exorcist and went, shit, pause the episode. I need to go watch this right now.
This is like the Turkish Star Wars, right? where
Yes.
we clearly just borrowed footage from a film and hopefully nobody noticed.
The difference being at no point did the director, quote unquote, of the Turkish Exorcist, Satan, just take some footage from the original Exorcist to make a movie. No. They were more enterprising, I guess, than that. They made their own version of The Exorcist, but from a highly, Turkish standpoint. Like, it is very much a film made in a, at that time, somewhat moderate Islamic country. So gone are the references to Catholicism. Inserted are some kind of half-hearted references at Islamic theology, a couple of deep cuts, I guess, if you want to look at it that way. But the more important thing is it had maybe a 19th of the budget of the original Exorcist. Not to mention like a 32nd or 64th of the amount of talent of the cast and crew. I'm not saying you shouldn't watch Satan. I'm telling you should. But I'm telling you that you don't get to be angry at me after you watch it because I've told you what to expect. If you are angry at me after you watch The Turkish Exorcist, sorry, not sorry.
This doesn't sound so bad. This is reminding me of the Spanish Dracula, where instead of re-recording all the dialogue and creating an alternative audio track, which is what the Hollywood process would become.
Sure.
They took advantage of, we have the sets built. Why can't we bring in an entirely different cast with a different filmmaker and let them use the set after hours to create the exact same film, but for another country? And in that case, the Spanish Dracula, some people say, is a more visually interesting film. Not necessarily better than what Bela Lugosi would do, but more interesting. And this doesn't sound so bad. Absolutely. You said it. They're making their own version of that classic horror film. That's interesting because it's not just a ripoff. It's what if we made this movie, but for our country, for our people, for people that have our expectations. If you're not Catholic, then Catholic dogma does not scare you.
Sure. The difference being, because I see your point, and I think you're making an incredibly valid, argumentative point. The difference being is that the cast of the Spanish language Dracula is a bunch of talented actors all working within a system, just using a big budget, set and all of that. The difference being is that the Turkish Exorcist, Satan, has a 14th of that talent and a 64th of the budget. It's the difference between a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, like eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and eating a photo of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. You know what I mean?
So this isn't Exorcist II from Saturday Night Live?
No, if you made a 14-hour adaptation of The Exorcist II featuring Richard Pryor, it'd be a much better movie.
I'd watch that film, especially if it was directed by Mel Brooks.
Fair, I'm on board. Mel, you've got a couple of years left, brother. Please get on top of it. Okay, so with all of that said, there's one other issue that I just haven't hit upon, and I think it's something that many films are guilty of today. Exorcist II, the Heretic, tries way too hard to accomplish way too much. I want you to think about it, okay? Linda Blair returning as Reagan could have been enough. Maybe it wouldn't have been as good as the original film, but it might have been enjoyable or just not terrible. Bare minimum, just not terrible. And hey, Linda Blair on screen, especially as a young woman, was always a welcome presence on screen. I wish she would have had a longer, better acting career than that, but whatever. Okay, fine. So what if Reagan refused to go back to the movie? Said, nah, I've done The Exorcist already. I don't need to do it. I'm going to move on to other things. Okay, if you cut that out, then the whole Father Lamont plot could have been really compelling too, right? There were plenty of good actors and characters there. Would have been silly given the whole Locust thing. I just can't.
It's not redeemable.
I just can't. But it would have been a coherent movie about the original Exorcist that was still connected to the original plot.
And that's okay, right? The film delivers. You mentioned the film is different than the book. And the book itself was very loosely based on an actual event.
Sure.
So as a film, calling it The Exorcist, it delivers. It delivers very cleverly. It's not about the person who is saved at the end. It's about the people who are performing the action of the exorcism. So it makes sense, if you're going to do that again, to make it about those people.
Sure. Wait, okay, and all of that is well and good. All of that is true. But if you stitch all of the extant parts together, instead of getting a quilt of a horror film, multiple disparate parts creating one coherent whole, you just kind of get Frankenstein's monster. Nothing in this movie makes sense in its context, and for that matter, it kind of doesn't have any context to begin with. Listen, I like all of the component parts of this film. But to me, this movie feels like the dissolution of a doomed marriage. The elements of this film, by themselves, are great. Maybe a little silly in a couple of spots, but they're great. They're a lot of fun. They're interesting. But when they are together, they're either explosive or just plain toxic. It's interesting to me that we can't shake off The Exorcist, even now. At the time of this recording, The Exorcist is a 51-year-old movie. Its shadow over the cinematic world is not just large, it's huge. You would think that Exorcist II, The Heretic, would be the last attempt at spinning off from the original, but there are, at the time of this release, 4 other films bearing the Exorcist namesake. We all know how dangerous sequelitis is, but sequelitis doesn't really cover it here. Exorcist III, for instance, is a really effective horror movie. Well, silly in a couple of spots, sure, but it has bone-chilling performances by guys like Brad Dourif. But that one wasn't supposed to be an Exorcist film. You know, Hollywood is always on a quest to suck the life from an intellectual property, and they did it again here. I do recommend you go and watch The Exorcist III if you haven't seen it before now. But go in knowing it wasn't supposed to be what it ended up being. It's easy to feel like there isn't much originality in the world of cinema, especially in the mainstream, compared to something like, I don't know, painting. Cinema is a newish form of art. Storytelling is one of man's oldest professions, sure, and cinema can be a storyteller par excellence. I suspect the only explanation for something like Exorcist II, The Heretic, is a desire to turn a profit. Yep, I know, we got there. Finally, the part of the episode where Lucas blames the Hollywood money-making machine.
And you know that's the real answer, right?
I mean, I'm sorry, I wouldn't say it if I didn't think I wasn't making a good point. We've all heard of Hollywood referred to as a machine. It's not just me coining a phrase here. Like all machines, just keep your fingers clear of the gears, right? I would like to be wrong about Hollywood, you know? Recently, I saw a trailer for Robert Eggers' reiteration of Nosferatu, the third of its kind, and I'm not gonna lie, it looks really good. Pardon the pun, but we can count on him, see what I did there, to not merely vampirize a concept. Oh, 2 puns for one. We can count on that concept to not just be going for a paycheck, I think. Something about Nosferatu demands a certain respect. Like there's something about that word, Nosferatu, that demands a noble thing. There's something big about it. Its shadow is huge too. The only other reiterations of it that are worth even referring to here are Elias Merhage's Shadow of the Vampire and Werner Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampire. You know, the remake and the kinda remake. And Joe, isn't it weird that Willem Dafoe is in Shadow of the Vampire and in Eggers' remake of Nosferatu? Like, how the fuck did that happen?
Is he playing Orlok in the remake?
No, he is not playing Orlok. He's playing Von Helsing.
I am in favor of that performance. I do think Shadow of the Vampire is the best thing you can do with a film that old.
Yeah.
I have a hard time watching remakes and believing it's anything other than the Hollywood machine trying to retain its copyright on something. We can't sell Nosferatu today, but we can make it again. It's really hard. How often do you watch a film and just say, I really want to just make this movie, but my way? I know it happens, but it's hard for me to watch something like that and say, you're not just trying to cash in on an old idea. We're trying to take a film that is here to date, nearly, if not 100 years old.
Oh, over.
And remember, to pardon the pun, from that wonderful TV show South Park, do you remember Nosferatu? Oh, you don't? Because you weren't alive? You've been told about it. Tell you what, we don't have a cut of that we can transfer and put on Blu-ray, so we're going to make a new Nosferatu. And that's going to make you talk about this film longer. It always rubs me the wrong way, but it's not always bad.
Yeah, you're kind of hitting on something that's kind of worth getting into, right? Like,
most of the time it is.
You've been my friend a long time. You know the bullshit I'm on when it comes to remakes and sequels. No, the point I want to make here is that, say what you will of Nosferatu, the original. I'm a fan of the movie, but I understand when people aren't. It's a weirdo silent movie with a lot of strange things. It's a movie with an incredible history. If you want a good afternoon, like you just want to read something fun, go read about the art designer and I think co-producer Albin Grau. He is a fucking fascinating character, just bizarre. But he ended up helping direct a lot of the artistic style of the movie. And Grau is a really cool character. He's worth checking out. He's worth getting into. And if anyone else were directing a reiteration, a remake, whatever you want to call it, of Nosferatu other than Robert Eggers, I'd be like, oh man, fuck off. There are very few directors I trust to do historical horror. I've talked a lot about The Witch, so I don't need to touch on it there. I'm a big fan of The Lighthouse. I feel like as a neat historical study, as a weird character study, it's really brilliant and really upsetting and a lot of fun. So I trust Eggers to do the right thing here and do this movie proud. And so long as he's not trying to hopelessly ape either Murnau or Herzog, he's probably gonna be fine. I think the difference is that, like, listen, again, I'm a fan of John Boorman, but after Zardoz, I'm amazed he got any directing jobs at all. And again, I love Excalibur, but when people tell me that it's silly or ridiculous or whatever, I really like it. I mean, everyone in that movie is amazing. There's a couple of people in that movie. I mean, people forget Patrick Stewart was in that film and went on to have a fucking huge career afterwards. And that says nothing of like Helen Mirren, who was in it and is amazing in it from front to back. Yeah, there's just some things that don't need reiteration. And Exorcist II is it. Back to my original point. The Exorcist deserves, like most of the cinematic veneration it receives. Back in our episode on demonic possession, I like I said then, I don't know that The Exorcist is the scariest movie ever made. Is it? I mean, compared to what? I don't know. But it is brilliant. And as far as I'm concerned, the only other film that deserves mention as part of the Exorcist canon is Repossessed with Leslie Nielsen.
I appreciate you mentioning this many years before Scary Movie was a thing.
Right, exactly. I can't help but feel that there's like a kind of subsequent tackiness to the subsequent Exorcist properties that wouldn't have happened if we all just watched Repossessed. And also, it's that I take seriously the inscription above one of the entrances to the St. Louis Art Museum. Art still has truth. Take refuge there. The Exorcist, I feel, is art. The Exorcist II, well, I'll let you decide.
I have spent a lot of time trying to discuss this film a different way. And we're getting close to the end on this one. So here's my pitch.
Mm-hmm.
Because we always ask ourselves, how did this happen? Why did this happen? The easy answer is the Hollywood machine. the less easy answer is the filmmaker did the best he could. But anytime something like this takes so much time to get right, you ask yourself, what was he trying to say? I recently watched Jodorowsky's Dune, and that man clearly was a fan of pick your controlled substance. He talks about it many times. The people in the film who talk about he came over to ask them to be a part of this project mention the fact that the man showed up with drugs.
Well, I mean, he hired Pink Floyd to do the original score. Of course he showed up with drugs. I love Pink Floyd, y'all, but let's just be real here for a minute.
What was he trying to say? What was a film in the 70s trying to do? So many of them did it. This director included. You've already mentioned Zardoz in all of its glory. Everyone who had access to hallucinogenics and psychedelics were trying to create art that recreated that experience. And I have tried for years to find something that I can tie back to The Exorcist II in the what is this film supposed to be? I don't think it was supposed to be The Exorcist until they forced it. So let's assume it is just that. If the character is on some type of trip, right? Because he's trying to find the root of evil so that he can do his due diligence and handle the evil once and for all. Let's assume that's the story. Have you seen the film 8mm?
Of course.
Mandy is a much better version of 8mm, would you agree?
No, but I know what our next episode is going to be, and I'll get around to Mandy in the next episode. However, I'm willing to entertain this.
I am
Go on.
not leading into spoiler territory here, but the film 8mm is a simple premise that is made to be gruesome and shocking and offend the viewer. And that is this innocent old lady who is now a widow discovers something in her husband's personal wares that she is appalled by. And she does not immediately jump to, what the fuck is wrong with my husband? Nope, it's so appalling. She has to hire Nicolas Cage to find out if it's real.
I want you to do me a favor, and I want you to leave this in. This is a little behind the scenes, BTS. Will you real quick pull up who directed 8mm? Because I think I know who it is, but I want to be sure before I go off half-cocked.
Joel Schumacher.
Joel Schumacher. Ladies and gentlemen, that's everything I need to tell you. Joel Schumacher, who directed Batman and Robin and The Phantom of the Opera starring Gerard Butler for some godforsaken reason. Yeah, Joel Schumacher is not an auteur, but I will say that 8mm is a damn sight better movie than Exorcist 2. In fact, it's a movie I kind of enjoy, but kind of in spite of my better interests. It is a much more interesting film than I think people give it credit for, and it's a good performance by Nicolas Cage and Joaquin Phoenix and Stormare. I can't remember his name. His first name, Peter Stormare, I think, and James Gandolfini. I mean, it is a truly bafflingly good cast with a really dark presence. Also, a lot of Aphex Twin is played in that, which I don't know what to make of that, but I like Aphex Twin, so okay, fine.
I bring up that film
Sure.
because it's the first example I have of a story. This is the answer to the question that I need. Either yes or no. Is this film real or not? And the person whose job it is to find it isn't sold as the world's greatest detective like Knives Out or Glass Onion.
Or for that matter, a Batman movie.
Correct. It's just somebody who gets so deep in the weeds that he knows before this is done and found out, he's going to be deep in that pit too. That might involve drugs, that might involve booze, that might involve pretending to be somebody that you're not and looking death literally in the face and acting like you're okay with it because he's going to find out the answer. I could only ever compare The Exorcist II to this film because I think that's what they're trying to do with this whole psychedelic thing. Did they succeed? Absolutely not. This film is batshit insane. I don't think The Exorcist II is good. If there's a drinking game for it, enjoy. But as a film, it's all over the fucking place. You've heard Lucas talk about it now for close to an hour, and I'm still talking because I want to find the reason they did what they did. Or maybe the director just adapted what they forced on him into he's trying to figure out what the evil actually is so that he can deal with it. That is not a bad concept. It's just not done well. And so many films from this time frame were trying to give the audience this idea of these colors and these visuals and things that we've seen when we've swallowed these pills. A film like 8mm does it better. It also came later. This might be one of the early examples of a film that just failed.
You know, the difference being, right? Like 8mm is one of those movies that, okay, I get it. You know, the FBI has been searching for snuff films for fucking 30 years, and they've never found a real, according to Hoyle, by the book definition snuff film. It mostly is kind of a thing that doesn't really exist that we've ever really seen in that context. Not in the way 8mm portrays it, right?
Agreed.
And whether or not you have a particular theological disposition that says exorcisms are real or fake, I'm pretty sure none of your theological dispositions hinge upon James Earl Jones dressed up as a locust vomiting apples for some reason. And that's kind of the problem, right? Like, listen, I don't like Schumacher as a director. I think he's mostly kind of a fucking hack. But I think 8mm is a pretty good movie. But 8mm is a sum of its parts kind of flick, right? Where else are you going to put Nicolas Cage and James Gandolfini in the same plot with Aphex Twin in the background? You're not. It doesn't happen.
Joaquin Phoenix.
A young Joaquin Phoenix for that matter. You know, we tend to think about these movies as sentient things, and I'm guilty of that, right? Like, you've heard me say, like, oh, this script thinks it's smarter than it is. Well, that's me turning a phrase. I don't really think scripts are sentient things or films are sentient things. And it's not that The Exorcist as a property or as a product is like a sentient being that needs keeping alive or has its own like sinister biology, right? It's a film. It's a movie. It's a product. It's something created by people. So maybe it does or doesn't deserve respect. Depends on your feelings about it as a film. We, as an audience, however, we love this stuff, right? We give a shit about these movies. I certainly do. And I still think, as a result, we should demand more when it comes from the creations being fed to us. And if those creations are spoiled, if they're clearly rotten, as The Exorcist II clearly is, we should spit them out. That's not what we want. We should spit them out so we don't get sick. I know that the food metaphor is maybe a little tortured. I get that. But it makes me want to ask you all a very important question. How do you like your cinema served to you, dear audience? Which is just another way of saying, what do you think? Is Exorcist II, The Heretic, the worst sequel ever made? And what do you think of the latter-day Exorcist properties, both the prequels and the sequel? Do you want me to stop talking about The Exorcist, possessions, and exorcisms? Because I do. I really do. I want to leave this topic alone for a little while. Anyway, you should drop us a line. We can be found wherever you get your podcasts, be that Stitcher, Apple, Spotify. You can find us everywhere. But you can also find us on YouTube. That's right, we're on YouTube. You can find us there. We can always be reached at the Fright Lab Podcast at gmail.com. You can find us on Instagram and Threads. We are new on Threads at Fright_Lab_pod or on Letterboxd as Fright Lab Pod, which I promise I will eventually start updating again. I'm sorry for that, but that's all one word, Fright Lab Pod. We are slowly but surely building up a fun, ongoing conversation on Discord. We would like you all to join us there. Joe, can you tell the gruesome people of our audience where they might find us on Discord and where else they might find your work?
Discord.thefrightlab.com. There will always be links in the show notes, and this is where the conversation is happening. It's happening wherever it can. You heard Lucas say it. We are on Threads now. Everything seems to be going very well on that particular platform, but we want to hear from you. However you want to have that conversation, we are here to have it. Discord is where I want you to be. That's where the conversation is continuing. You heard Lucas say it before, the Fright Lab podcast at gmail.com. There will be Patreon. It's coming in 2025, and we appreciate all of you that listen to this podcast. If this is your first episode, welcome. If this is not your first episode, welcome back. Are you having as much fun as we are? Clearly, we're having a great time watching all the films, not just the good ones that are horrifying.
Except for Exorcist II. We did not enjoy that in the slightest.
What I want from you now, please take out your phone. Scroll to the left, the right. Find the place where the 5-star review or the thumbs up can be left and leave it. We need to know what you think about these episodes, and we want to hear from you. Lucas, please tell everyone how much we love independent artists and independent media.
Something I want to remind the audience in light of this film is that John Boorman was at one point in time a very popular director. Maybe he shouldn't have been. Maybe he shouldn't have been. But I can tell you where a lot of good things are happening, and that's independent media. There's no one company. There's no one set of money. It's all happening because people just believe. And they believe, like I believe, that we can do better and do more. And we want to help all of those people do better and do more. Are you making a horror movie? A horror podcast? Some next level dark ambient shit? Are you, in fact, doing a horror punk pop contest? I don't know what that sounds like. I'm just throwing words together right now. But if you're doing that, if you're just throwing words together to see what sticks, we want to know about it. Reach out to us once again, the Fright Lab podcast at gmail.com, so we can help you guys get some stuff off the ground and get you a little exposure. Which means, as always, the Fright Lab is conceptualized, researched, and written by me, Lucas Yoakum. Joseph Wren is our co-host and producer extraordinaire. We appreciate each and every one of you, and we'll talk to you all again very soon.